I just briefly mentioned archetypes last time. So, not archetypes, synchronicities. So I want to talk more about synchronicities. And the synchronicity is when something happens in the external world which seems to correspond to something going on in the internal world as well at the same time. And therefore, it communicates some sort of a meaning to the person to whom it happens. And, well, I'll read you this story. This is from Cosmos and Psyche. I don't remember if I told you about this book before, but it's by Richard Tarnas. I'm sure I talked about at least one of his books before. I just don't remember if it was this one or not. So anyway, let me just read this. This is about a very synchronicity that had a real impact upon human history. And there have been many, actually, but I'll read you this one. On rare occasions, a synchronicity proves to have an extraordinary power through its impact on an historically significant individual, so that it ultimately plays a pivotal role in the collective life of the larger culture. The famous coincidence that formed a turning point in the life of Petrarch took place at the climax of his ascent of Mount Ventoux in April 1336, an event that has long been regarded by scholars as representing the symbolic beginning of the Renaissance. For many years, Petrarch had sensed a growing impulse to ascend the mountain, to see the vast panorama from its peak, though doing such a thing was virtually unheard of in his time. Finally, choosing the day with his brother for a companion, he made the long ascent, marked by intense physical exertion and inward reflection. When he at last attained the summit, with clouds beneath his feet and winds in his face, Petrarch found himself overwhelmed by the great sweep of the world that now opened out to him. Snow-capped mountains and the sea in the distance, rivers and valleys below, the wide expanse of skies in every direction. James Hillman recounts the event. At the top of the mountain, with the exhilarating view of French Provence, the Alps, and the Mediterranean spread before him, he had opened his tiny pocket copy of Augustine's Confessions. Turning at random to book 10:8, he read, "And men go abroad to admire the heights of mountains, the mighty billows of the sea, the broad tide of rivers, the compass of the ocean, and the circuits of the stars, and pass themselves by." Petrarch was stunned at the coincidence between Augustine's words and the time and place they were read. His emotion both announced the revelation of his personal vocation and heralded the new attitude of the Renaissance. Petrarch draws this crucial conclusion from the Mount Ventoux event: nothing is admirable but the soul. So, the thing is that before the Renaissance, humans had basically thought of themselves as miserable worms, right? So, but the Renaissance required something more than that, because the Renaissance celebrated humanity, celebrated the creativity and individuality. So this, for Petrarch, this was like a big turning point, and it was a big turning point for the world, because this mountain is calling to him, this incredible mountain, and he goes up there and he looks and he sees the world laid before him, and he's so deeply moved and impressed. And then he reads the people go to mountains and they are so impressed with what they see, but they don't see it in themselves. They don't see anything in themselves. So he realizes the way that he's been living his life. And I think because it was such a amazing occasion, I mean, this is, because he felt it was really an occasion that was set up, that he'd been pushed towards, it was really meaningful to him. So as he comes down the mountain, then he realizes that he should change. He should celebrate humanity. He should be able to celebrate himself in some way. And of course, this is considered simple by the church and pretty much everybody up to that point. But that's what the Renaissance was. It was when humanity finally decided to celebrate humanity, humanity's creativity, self-expression, and so on. So it was very meaningful, and that's what is considered to be a synchronicity. And so I used the word archetypes in there. Let's go over here. All right. So if you have synchronicities, you're sort of implying that somebody's trying to communicate to somebody, right? It's, in some sense, it's more than just a coincidence. What are we saying? Are we saying the universe is trying to say something to Petrarch? Is somebody trying to, did somebody push him to go up that mountain? Is it God that pushed him up the mountain? Is it his own higher self that pushed him up the mountain? Right? So who or what would have a greater sense of what humanity could be? So I think there's a lot of different ways to think about this, actually, and I wouldn't say that one of them is valid and the others aren't. I think the sort of automatic way we might tend to look at this is, well, God is pushing him up the mountain in order to move humanity forward. Maybe. Okay. I think another way to think of it is more, if you think of everything as having some kind of underlying consciousness, some aspect of mind, then I think you can look for the expression, and higher expression of this consciousness is trying to break through. The universe itself is trying to create a higher expression of consciousness through humanity. Alright? Now, that's a sort of weird way to think of it, right? We're not always used to that, although I think it's getting much more accepted these days. But anyway, so I'm going to sort of I'm going to read a little bit about Jung's thinking so that we can understand how he has not explained this, but what he's come to in his life. So Jung saw nature and one's surrounding environment as a living matrix of potential synchronistic meaning that could illuminate the human sphere. He attended to sudden or unusual movements or appearances of animals, flocks of birds, the wind, storms, the sudden louder lapping of the lake outside the window of his consulting room, and similar phenomena as possessing possible symbolic relevance for the parallel unfolding of interior psychological realities. So he sees the interior unfolding as the exterior is communicating, in a sense, okay? So, in sharp contrast to the modern worldview, Jung ceased to regard the outer world as merely a neutral background against which the human psyche pursued its isolated, intrasubjective quest for meaning and purpose. Rather, all events, inner and outer, were recognized as sources of potential psychological and spiritual significance. So then also, Jung had this idea of the collective unconscious that is somehow influencing all of us, that we are all in touch with the collective unconscious. And so in the collective unconscious, he sees experience as sort of through the eyes of the archetype. So let me just read what an archetype is, and we'll see if we can go from there. So Jung had come to view archetypes as innate symbolic forms and psychological dispositions that unconsciously structure and impel human behavior and experience at both the personal and collective level. So they are self-portraits of the instincts, and render human experience meaningful according to certain timeless universal patterns or forms. light and dark, birth and death, rebirth, the hero, the great mother, the child, the trickster, the shadow, good and evil, eros and logos, feminine and masculine, and so on. So he sort of thought these are psychological structures that we are all in touch with, and in some sense our lives are sort of playing out these archetypes in infinitely many different forms and fashions and so on. But really these archetypes are sort of informing our collective mind, informing our psyche, okay? And so we are expressing them. So it's not that somebody is trying to shape humanity, but then you see, actually you do come up with this idea, because you do come up with the idea of a intended shaping, actually. But why is that intention there, right? And what is the intention? So to my mind, it's come more to the idea of the collective unconscious expressing itself on a deeper level, but also maintaining the harmony, trying to heal where an individual expression of the collective unconscious, which is a fancy way to say a human being, where a human being's psyche is hurt, then the collective unconscious comes to try to heal that, and by balancing itself in some way. And so that is what is happening. So it doesn't have to be a conscious shaping. We don't have to look for a God who is trying to make something happen. But that's also a completely valid way to look at it, if that's what is meaningful. So again, I think we are moving, because of our scientific, expertise and so on, we're moving to a place where some sort of distributed field or consciousness is more acceptable to our way of thinking.